This is just way out of my comfort zone. Kimberly knows this. She says, please come, and I come. But it really is good to be here with all of you. And we're going to be talking about learning by heart today. And to get started, I'm just wondering, you know, in history there have been a lot of King Charleses. And so to differentiate between the different Charleses, they had to use names like Charles the Fat or Charles the Ugly to kind of differentiate. But I'm wondering, how many of you have an image or an impression in your mind or your heart about King Charles I of England? Does anything come to you? I hope that it doesn't, actually. I tried to pick somebody that I don't think. Okay, good. We're going to try and bring him to life today with a little artistry. First of all, let's try and connect him to something familiar that you already probably know. You all know about the Mayflowers and the Pilgrims? Do you have a year when the Pilgrims came to and landed on the Mayflower? A year? Anybody? 16. Close? A little bit more? Pilgrims landed on Mayflower, landed at Mayflower at 1620. So King Charles I became King of England 3 years after the Pilgrims landed. So when you hear these stories of the Puritans settling Boston and such, he's the king back home in England. He's the one they're fleeing from. So now King Charles's dad was King James of the King James Version of the Bible. And his grandmother, his father's mother, was poor Mary Queen of Scots, who actually lost her head. And do you ladies want to sit over here? And then I won't kind of do this tennis match going on. She actually had James taken away from her when he was only 10 months old, and she never saw him again. It was a very, very tragic thing. All right, now we're going to use a little artistry to see if we can bring him to life. And first, what I'm going to do is share a story with you that's for little children, and I'm going to combine it with a fine art lesson. All right, here we go. No, we don't want him yet. There we go. Once there lived and can you all hear me? I don't have a real loud voice. All right. Once there lived a very beautiful queen and a very proud king. They had 3 beautiful children whom they loved very dearly. They were proud of these children and gave them everything they could to make them happy. They had such a great number of toys, they almost filled a large room. There were several servants who brought out the toys and put them away again, and who had nothing else to do but wait upon these children. The children had a fine large yard to play in too. It was so large, in fact, they called it a park. One day they were having a good time in the park when they were told their mother wanted them. They were to get dressed and go and have their pictures painted. There were no cameras in those days, so instead there was a great artist whose name was Sir Anthony Van Dyck. He painted beautiful pictures with oil paints. The oldest child had already had his picture painted so many times, he probably would not have cared to go if it had not been for the boat ride he knew he would have. You see, the King's Palace and Sir Anthony Van Dyck's house both stood near the banks of the same river. Sir Anthony had a private boat landing made just for the king and queen and their children. The king liked so much to watch Sir Anthony Van Dyck paint that he used to visit him nearly every single day. It must have taken a long time for those children to get dressed and ready to go. When at last they were all ready, the boats were waiting for them. It was a beautiful ride down the river to Sir Anthony Van Dyck's house. The great Van Dyck himself came out to meet them. He was glad to have 3 such lovely children to paint. He was very fond of children, and he liked to have a great many people about him as he painted. The ladies wore beautiful dresses, and the men too were dressed in velvets and silks and carried shining swords. Van Dyck was very fond of music and always had some musicians playing while he painted. The children liked the music too, and it made them forget that they were standing so long. The child standing so straight with his hand on the dog's head is a boy, although he's dressed much like a girl. His name is Prince Charles. I don't see how he could run or even walk in such a long, heavy dress, do you? Van Dyck had a very large, fine dog, and as soon as the dog saw the children, he came right up to them. He seemed to like Prince Charles the best and sat beside him all the time his picture was being painted. He liked to feel the soft stroke of Prince Charles's kind hand. Prince Charles grew up to be King Charles II. He did not like to do anything but have a good time, so people called him the Merry Monarch. He nearly always took a dog with him wherever he went, even to church. He seemed to like a certain very small dog best, and people named these dogs after him. They called them King Charles Spaniels. Have you ever seen a King Charles Spaniel? Baby Stuart, as people like to call Prince James, wore blue silk trimmed with lace. He looks a little shy as he stands there holding his apple tight in his chubby little hands. Probably the Queen Mother gave Baby Stuart the big red apple. He was only 2 years old, and she thought he might get hungry or need something to play with. Baby Stuart grew up to be a great naval officer who fought and won battles on a big boat at sea. When the brother died, he became king. When you look at Baby Stuart, you feel sure he will grow up to be a good king. But do you know? He was not a good king. The people did not like him at all and even drove him out of the country. But we like to think of him always as a pretty baby whose Queen Mother used to sing him to sleep, just as other mothers do. Their sister Mary must have held some roses in her hand and dropped them. Can you see them on the rug in front of her? Van Dyck painted a curtain just back of the children, and through the window we see a rose bush, which may be the one that the little Princess Mary picked the roses from. When Princess Mary was only 10 years old, she was married to William, Prince of Orange, who was only 15 years of age. But she lived in her own home until she grew up. When at last she did go to live in her husband's country, everyone was glad to see her, for she was such a good and wise princess. She often helped her brothers too, for it seemed as if they were always in trouble. The great artist Van Dyck painted many pictures of these three children, but the king and queen liked this one best of all. Now, my daughter read this story to her little girls when they were, very little, and a couple years later she was reading a story that I'm about to tell you about King Charles, and her little daughter said, "Mom, wait, isn't that the king that was the father of these three little girls?" Which is entirely the point of this whole exercise, is these images make long-lasting impressions, and as you start to put them into your children's hearts, as you go along, they start connecting. And that's a very important part of what we're going to talk about. So I would now like to paint a scene in your heart. But first, let me give you a visual of King Charles I himself. This is another Van Dyck painting, and it gives you several angles to look at him from. And just for a little perspective, he's 5'4" tall. And now a little background. It's just a little guy. I think they were all little back then, don't you think? Charles was one of those kings that believed in the divine rights of kings. That's just how he was raised. But it got him into trouble because he kept disbanding Parliament every time they got into his way. And so Oliver Cromwell thought that he had a much better idea, which meant getting King Charles out of the way. So charges of treason were brought against him. The year is now 1649, so he has been king for about 26 years, and 3 more children have been born to him, he and the queen. He has a daughter aged 13, a son aged 8, and another daughter aged 5. So let me paint the scene and get comfortable because it's going to take a little time, okay? It was still dark in London as the watchmen making their morning rounds bawled, "Past 5 o'clock on a cold, snowy morning." Bitterly cold it was, this 30th day of January, 1649. In his apartment in St. James's Palace, the king was still sleeping quite peacefully. On a pallet beside his bed, his faithful servant Herbert was wakeful, however. Indeed, he had scarcely closed an eye through a night that seemed endless. At 5:30, the king awoke. "I will get up now," he said to his servant, "for I have a great work to do today." As the cold seeped into the chamber, the king chose the clothing he would wear with an eye to its warmth. "I will not have the people see me shiver in the cold lest they think me afraid," he told Herbert. Dressing the king took about an hour. For a year he had allowed his beard to grow out, and his chestnut-colored hair was beginning to turn white. At about 10, there was a gentle tap on the bedchamber door. "It is time to go to Whitehall, sir." Taking the bishop by the hand, he smiled and said, "Come, let us be going." As they made their way, a deafening roll of drums began, drawn up in a double line on each side of the path that ran across the park were companies of infantry armed with muskets. They were holding back the dense throng of spectators behind them. The pace of the procession was slow. Now Whitehall Palace loomed ahead. And then inside the palace grounds, as he was taken through the long passage known as the Stone Gallery, here he was then taken, and here hung the king's collection of masterpieces by the celebrated painters of the time, for he was a great lover and patron of the arts. From the Stone Gallery, the king entered the building which housed the royal apartments. Here he was taken to await the summons. He hoped it would not be long in coming. A wooden platform had been built against the side of the banqueting hall. Around it a black cloth had been stretched. Behind the black cloth, around the platform, was the scaffold on which the king was to die. In an outer room of the apartments, a guard approached. "There is a man outside who demands to see the king. He says it is most urgent and refuses to go away." The man was Henry Seymour, who had once been page of honor to the king. When he told his errand, he was brought straight to the royal apartments. Entering the chamber where the king was, Seymour burst into a flood of tears. He knelt, kissed the king's hand, and then clasped him about the legs in an agony of grief. Then he handed the king a letter from his son Charles, the heir to the English throne, who had sent this envoy from France with all possible speed. The king read the letter slowly and carefully. For the first time, his melancholy face was touched with a deeper sadness. Enclosed with the letter was a sheet of paper. The only thing on it, at the very bottom, was the prince's signature. Seymour then explained that a second copy of this paper had been given to the Puritan leaders who now controlled England. They could fill in whatever they wished on the paper above the signature, he said. "Your son will do anything, Seymour added. He will even give up his right of succession to the throne." The king's smile made his dour face radiant. He threw the paper with his son's signature into the fire. Then he gave Seymour a letter he had already written, a message to his beloved son. Now was not the time to back down. At his trial, he had declared, "It is not my case alone. It is the freedom and liberty of the people of England. I must justly stand for these liberties. If power without law may make law, I do not know what subject in England can be assured of his life or anything he can call his own." The previous night, two of his children, 13-year-old Elizabeth and 8-year-old Henry, were brought to him. The others had escaped to safety. A bishop witnessed the event. As the children wept, Charles told them they must not be too sad, for he was dying gloriously for law, liberty, and the true Protestant religion. He told the prince that the Puritans might try to make him king so they could use him for their own purposes, and that he must not yield to them as long as his older brothers were alive. "I will sooner be torn to pieces," the little fellow cried. Then the king divided his jewels and bid farewell. The time of execution arrived. The king's step was firm and steady as he stepped out upon the platform. The king was allowed to speak, and he spoke for some time. He said he was innocent of the crime with which he had been charged. Then he said, as his grandmother, Mary Queen of Scots, had said before him, "I have forgiven all the world, and even those in particular that have been the chief cause of my death. And finally, I die a Christian." The king then spoke to one of the executioners. "I shall say but a short prayer," he said. "When I hold out my hands thus, strike." The king then took the white cap from the bishop and put it on. He tucked his long curls under it to leave his neck bare. Then he disappeared from the view of those in the courtyard as he lay down with his head on the block. They saw only the flash of the axe as the executioner brought it down. A spectator wrote later, "At the instant when the blow was given, There was such a dismal, universal groan among the people as I never heard before, and desire I may never hear again. King Charles I was dead. England had killed him. Rulers before him had been deposed from the throne or forced into exile. One who came after him would be ousted. But never before had an English king been executed, nor would there be one afterwards. What had caused England to rid itself of Charles I in this way? It was part of the struggle by the country's liberty-loving people for freedom, a struggle that had begun more than 4 centuries earlier. You have just experienced learning by heart. The next time someone says, "Do you know who King Charles I is?" or you read the name King Charles I in print, all these images and impressions will come back to you in a flash, just like that. Now, this isn't the complete picture of Charles. Was he a good king or a bad king? Was he a good man or a bad man? Even scholars disagree. But would you like to know more? You now have something to build upon. Rudyard Kipling wrote, "If history were taught in the form of stories, it would never be forgotten." I would expand that to say, if any subject was taught in the form of stories, it will not be forgotten. We say in one ear and out the other, but we don't say in one eye and out the other, because images go in and they last forever. That's one reason pornography is so dangerous, because those images go in and we can't let go of them. Images are long lasting. The reason the stories stay with us is because they paint pictures on our heart, moving scenes on our heart, and attach them to our feelings, and they become long lasting. So learning by heart is a vital part of a pattern for learning that I'm going to share. And this is where you've got your little charts. If you want to pull them out and fill in while you go along, it might help you to pay attention. This is at the core of everything I do. And some of you I know have heard this pattern of learning, but I hope maybe I'll say some things that will mix it up a little bit. Because if you truly come to understand this pattern, a lot of things are going to fall into place with what you're doing with your children. Yes, I have plenty. I could wallpaper my house with bookmarks, so I have many, many. All right, everybody have some? We have become a very academically minded culture. Our schools focus on training the minds of our children. When you can test or measure something, you are dealing in the mind. So how many miles is it to the sun? Or what's the population of New York? That's a question you can test or measure, and that's a mind thing. The mind is fed with facts and information. Our schools designate what grade level they want a fact taught, and parents feel really proud when their child is above grade level, and they panic when they're told their child is below grade level. We measure a student's performance and the teacher's performance by the tests that they take, but tests can only measure facts and information. The buzzwords for mind-based learning are critical thinking skills and scientific reasoning. And I apologize for reading. My poor old brain can't hold on to things anymore. So I'll try and look at you, and I just have to do this, or I won't get through it. Okay. We connect the mind to the realm of science, which is, in its essence, all about discovering the laws, the rules, and principles upon which everything in the world and the universe operates. Science involves experimenting and proving, and so we teach our children the rules of math, the rules of grammar, punctuation and spelling, the rules of phonics and writing. We teach them the laws of physics, the laws of thermodynamics, and the laws of economics. The words law and order go together. Complying with rules creates order. If you've ever traveled to a country where they don't have any traffic laws, you know it's a chaotic place to be. It's not safe to be there. On the other hand, scientists who gaze out into the universe are struck with awe at the perfect order, harmony, and majesty of galaxies and stars and planets, all abiding the laws within their respective spheres. There are also principles and laws by which civilizations prosper and flourish. Our liberty is in law. Even happiness is governed by law. Law is a good thing. This type of learning is systematic and sequential. You have to learn the rules of arithmetic before you learn the rules of algebra. But facts and information are very hard to hold on to, and they go into short-term memory. In fact, much of the time in school is spent trying to get facts to stick. A child may hold on long enough to take a test, but then they tend to wash away. We use a word for this type of learning that we have at school. We call it academic learning. Have you ever looked up the word academic in the dictionary? I did, and this is what I found. Academic. Having no practical importance, not involving or relating to anything real or practical, having no practical or useful significance. And as if that's not bad enough, we don't just want academics, we want rigorous academics. Well, rigorous and rigor mortis have the same root word, rigor, which means stiffness and rigidness and even voluntary submission to pain. And we want to extend the academic year so it's longer, and we want to start academics at a younger and younger age. What we seem to have forgotten is something Aristotle understood over 2,000 years ago. Educating the mind without educating the heart is no education at all. Plato also understood all learning is based in emotion. The heart develops before the brain, within the womb, and emotions develop before the intellect outside the womb. The heart is what pumps life into the brain. A person is still alive as long as the heart is pumping, even if the brain waves have ceased. But the brain cannot function without the heart. Yet here we are cutting the heart out of education, partly because it cannot be measured or tested. The heart is fed with impressions, feelings, and images. Heart learning falls within the realm of the arts. You even find the word art in the word heart. The artist's tools include music, poetry, pictures, and story. These languages of the heart travel to a place within us that words alone cannot reach. In fact, one of the primary functions of these things is to stir emotion. The word emotion is primarily made up of motion. So it's when our feelings are stirred that we are moved into motion, that we are moved into action and do things. This stage of learning is all about desire. It's about warming and opening up the heart. Learning in this stage can be random and spontaneous because impressions made on the heart go into long-term memory and are held onto long enough to connect and interlace with other impressions. If a fact can be connected to something you have in your heart, the fact goes into long-term storage. Now, the third part of the pattern of learning, and the most important part, is spirit. Picture the heart as a beautiful melody, the mind is the rhythm or the order, and now the spirit provides the full orchestration. The Spirit, or the light of Christ, is a sort of spiritual sunshine. It's a divine energy, power, or influence that proceeds from God through Christ and gives life and light to all things, including our learning. Other names are truth, bread of life, and living waters, which when we drink of these waters, we never thirst again. The Holy Ghost makes use of this light in His work. It requires our faith to believe in it because we cannot see or measure it, but we know it's there by its fruits, which include joy, peace, love, and kindness. This power is a creative power. It takes our learning and turns it into a usefulness. To be inspired means to take in spirit. Anything under its influence will serve to lift us up and enlarge our souls and improve us. The world was not created from nothing. Rather, the Lord saw matter unorganized, and He organized it. Let there be light was the first part in the creation story, and yet the sun doesn't come for a couple more days. So the light is referring to this creative power, although the light is also in the sun. This light fills the immensity of space. Our job is to provide the raw materials, the matter unorganized, for the Spirit to work with. The more we give the Spirit, the more can be accomplished. If I go out on a dark summer night and shine a flashlight into a dark sky, I'm not going to see any light unless it finds some dust particles or leaves to reflect off of. Likewise, we need to give the Spirit something to shine on, something to reflect on. That's our job. The scriptures teach us that light cleaves to light. Light cleaves to light. So when we fill our hearts with that which is good and true and beautiful and comply with eternal laws and principles, we give the Spirit much to organize into a usefulness with which it will multiply and replenish the earth. Okay, hold on. We are warned of people who are ever learning but never coming to a knowledge of the truth. Now you can read that as in never coming to a knowledge about the truth, but as I've come to understand this pattern of learning, I read it as coming to a knowledge by way of the truth, or the light, or the Spirit of Christ. It is learning by the Spirit. Hard-heartedness and or willful breaking of laws or principles blocks it. This stage of learning is very purposeful and customized to the calling and mission of the individual, and the learning is infinite and eternal. After I found this pattern, I now find it all over the place. Both the Old and New Testaments are front-end loaded with stories. Most of the stories we're familiar with are in the book of Genesis or in the 4 Gospels of the New Testament. And then come the laws, principles, commandments, doctrines. And at the back of the books, you find the books like Isaiah and Revelation that require a lot of preparatory learning, and that the true meaning actually cannot be found out except through spirit-to-spirit communication. In modern times, we were given the Book of Mormon first. The Book of Mormon is primarily a book of stories. Then came the Doctrine and Covenants, doctrine, laws, rules. That was followed by the temple, where spirit-to-spirit learning takes place. And even within the temple, for those that have gone, if you think, it's first music, imagery, story, and then covenants and laws, and then spirit-to-spirit learning. John the Baptist's role was to open and warm the hearts of the people with a desire, and then Jesus came and taught the law of the gospel in preparation to receive the gift of the Holy Ghost, who would teach them all things that they should do. You find the pattern in the sacrament prayer. First, we're told to always remember Jesus, and how do we do that except with pictures, stories, and then keep His commandments, that we may have His Spirit to be with us. First 4 principles of the gospel. Faith is a heart thing. Repentance and baptism is a commandment thing, followed by the Holy Ghost, who teaches us all things. And we even find it in the plan of salvation. In the pre-existence, we were given a desire or a vision of possibilities. And we shouted for joy. I believe not only out of joy, but for the potential of joy, that we saw that there was going to be a way for us to have great joy. Now the purpose of this mortal stage is to see if we will do all things that we are commanded. We are here to fit ourselves to a law, and according to the law that we are willing to abide, that determines the kingdom of glory we inherit. And what is the difference between the kingdoms? Glory, our capacity for light. So those who are willing to abide a higher law will have a greater capacity. Those that have more light stored within them will have a greater capacity than those who have not. You take away the spirit, you take away the heart, and what's left is purely academic. So what does this have to do with homeschooling and learning? Let me suggest 2 applications. First one, nature has reserved childhood for making impressions on the heart. Why do we not baptize children until the age of 8? Because the Lord said prior to the age of 8, they do not have the reasoning power to choose between right and wrong. The brain is not fully developed, which neuroscientists can observe. So in childhood, a child's heart is uncluttered and open. As Pestalozzi taught, who was one of the early heart-based educators, it is for a long time the business of the heart before it is the business of reason. Childhood is like the Garden of Eden of life, which I'll talk about more tomorrow. But today I'd like to talk about the other application, which is never teach any subject academically until after the heart is warmed and opened. So, let's take a little time and apply a little artistry to the Civil War. First, a little music. The Battle Cry of Freedom was composed by George Frederick Root in 1862. The song was so popular that the music publisher had 14 printing presses going on at one time and still could not keep up with the demand. It's estimated that over 700,000 copies of this song were put into circulation. A soldier tells us this: "A glee club came down from Chicago bringing with them the new song, 'We'll Rally Round the Flag Boys,' and it ran through the camp like wildfire. The effect was little short of miraculous. It put as much spirit and cheer into the army as a victory. Day and night one could hear it by every campfire and in every tent. I shall never forget how the men rolled out the line, and although he may be poor, he shall never be a slave.' I do not know whether Mr. Root knows what good work his song did for us there, but I hope so." Let's take a minute and listen to it. And I used to have a louder speaker. Let's hope this will carry. All right, I saw some feet tapping. You just get swept into it. By listening to the song, and better yet, by singing the song, you enter into the spirit of the times, of what these soldiers were feeling. And interestingly, this same song moved the hearts of the Confederate soldiers too. They tweaked the words a little bit, and my heart made note. Both sides truly believed that they were fighting for freedom. Interesting. Now let's combine a little illustration with some poetry. This is an N.C. Wyeth illustration of a poem called The Picket Guard. And at the time, the usual headline in the paper was "All Quiet on the Potomac." But one day in September in 1861, the headline read, "A Picket Shot," and it prompted this poem by Ethel Lynn Beers. "All quiet along the Potomac, they say, except now and then a stray picket is shot as he walks on his beat to and fro by a rifleman hid in the thicket. 'Tis nothing, a private or two now and then will not count in the news of the battle. Not an officer lost, only one of the men, moaning out all alone the death rattle. All quiet along the Potomac tonight, where the soldiers lie peacefully dreaming. Their tents in the rays of the clear autumn moon or the light of the watchfires are gleaming. A tremulous sigh as the gentle night wind through the forest leaves softly is creeping, while stars up above with their glittering eyes keep guard, for the army is sleeping. There's only the sound of the lone sentry's tread as he tramps from the rock to the fountain, and thinking of the two in the low trundle bed far away in the cot on the mountain. His musket falls slack His face, dark and grim, grows gentle with memories tender, as he mutters a prayer for the children asleep, for their mother. May heaven defend her. The moon seems to shine just as brightly as then that night, when the love yet unspoken leaped up to his lips, when low murmured vows were pledged to be ever unbroken. Then, drawing his sleeves roughly over his eyes, he dashes off tears that are welling, and gathers his gun closer up to its place, as if to keep down the heart swelling. He passes the fountain, the blasted pine tree. The footstep is lagging and weary, yet onward he goes through the broad belt of light toward the shades of the forest so dreary. Hark! Was it the night wind that rustled the leaves? Was it moonlight so wondrously flashing? It looked like a rifle. Ah, Mary, goodbye. And the lifeblood is ebbing and plashing. All quiet along the Potomac tonight. No sound save the rush of the river, while soft falls the dew on the face of the dead. The pickets off duty forever. That one hits deep. So let's make a different impression. Same illustration. This one's Alice Mayhouse. Jesus, lover of my soul, let me to thy bosom fly, while the waters near me roll, while the tempest still is nigh, high. It was on an ocean steamer, and one voice above the rest, beautiful, pure, rich and mellow, all the air with music blessed. Something more, a faint remembrance broke upon the listener's ear. Yes, he thought, 'tis not the first time that sweet voice is mine to hear. Silence followed. Then the stranger stepped up to the singer rare. Were you in the Civil War, sir? A Confederate, I was there. Then a time, a place were mentioned. Were you? Yes. And strange to say, this same hymn was then my comfort that you hear me sing today. Dark the night, so cold and dreary, and my boyish heart felt low, pacing there on sentry duty, dangerously near the foe. Midnight came, the darkness deepened, thoughts of home forebodings brought. So for comfort, prayer and singing dissipated gloomy thought. All my trust on thee is stayed, all my hope from thee I bring. Cover my defenseless head with the shadow of thy wing. Then a strange peace came upon me, no more fear and gloom that night. Dawn came, heralding the morrow ere the first faint streak of light. Then the other told his story. I, a Union soldier true, in those woods that very evening with my scouts were passing through. You were standing, and our rifles covered you. We heard you sing, cover my defenseless head with the shadow of thy wing. 'Twas enough. Boys, I said, come, lower rifles, we'll go home. Poetry combines the imagery of words with the rhythm of music to stir our feelings. It's a powerful heart tool. Now I'm going to pull one more tool out of my artist kit, and this tool is the story, and it's probably the tool that you will use most often to warm and open up the hearts of your children. This time I'm going to try and bring the two generals to life. And let's start with General Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general. This was right after the Battle of Gettysburg. I was badly wounded, says a private of the Army of the Potomac. A ball had shattered my left leg. I lay on the ground not far from Cemetery Ridge, and as General Lee ordered his retreat, he and his officers rode near me. As he came along, I recognized him, and though faint from exposure and loss of blood, I raised up my hands, looked Lee in the face, and shouted as loud as I could, "Hurrah for the Union!" The general heard me, looked, stopped his horse, dismounted, and came toward me. I confess I at first thought he meant to kill me, but as he came up, he looked down at me with such a sad expression on his face that all fear left me, and I wondered what he was about. He extended his hand to me and, grasping mine firmly, looking right into my eyes, said, "My son, I hope you will soon be well." If I live 1,000 years, I will never forget the expression on General Lee's face. Here he was defeated, retiring from a field that cost him and his cause almost their last hope. And yet he stopped by to say words like those to a wounded soldier of the opposition who had taunted him as he passed by. As soon as the general had left me, I cried myself to sleep there on the bloody ground. All right, let's bring Ulysses S. Grant, and this one's going to be a little longer. Settle in. Ulysses S. Grant was 60 years old. He was healthy, wealthy, and wise. It seemed as though nothing could disturb or molest him, and yet, at one blow, the old general was struck down, wounded in the tenderest of all places, his honor, his reputation, his word. It was this way. In 1880, he had gone into business, investing $100,000 in the banking business in which one of his sons was a partner. But General Grant was not an active partner in the business. He just invested money. At first, the firm made lots of money. General Grant's name, of course, gave people confidence. And one of the partners was such a sharp and shrewd businessman that people called him the Napoleon of finance. On the morning of Tuesday, the 6th of May, 1884, General Grant was, as he thought, a millionaire. Before sunset that same day, he knew he was ruined. The bank had failed. The Napoleon of finance, whom everyone thought so smart a businessman, had been too smart. He had speculated and lost everything. Worse than this, he had lied and stolen. He had used the name and fame of General Grant to back up wicked schemes and dishonorable transactions. He had used up all the money put into the business by General Grant and Mrs. Grant and the others who had gladly put in money because of General Grant's name. And he had so turned and twisted and handled things that not a dollar was left in the business. General Grant and his sons were ruined. Their good names, apparently, were disgraced by being mixed up with the affairs and wickednesses of their bad and bold partner, who, as soon as he saw the truth was out, ran away like the thief and coward he was. Everyone was surprised. More than this, they were so startled that for a time even the great name of Grant seemed to be clouded, and thoughtless people, cruel people, the folks who liked to talk and to say things without thinking of the consequences, said mean and hateful and wicked and untruthful things about this great and noble soldier who never in his life had done a dishonorable act or said a mean or unkind thing. It was hard, was it not? It was especially hard on such a man as General Grant. He never complained. He never spoke of the treatment to his friends, but it hurt terribly. It made him sick, and he developed a terrible trouble in his throat, cancer, that brought him months of suffering, of torture, and of agony. He set to work to do something to earn money. At first he was discouraged, for as he looked at the wreck of his fortune made by the dreadful business failure and knew that he was a sick man, no longer able to work to make his own living, a future looked very dark, and he could not see how he could make things better for his wife or the boys he so dearly loved. Then it was determined to write, as did Julius Caesar, the story of his life, his battles and campaign. He saw a way out of his difficulties. He determined to try. Then the world saw one of the most remarkable things in all its long history. A sick man without experience or training, deliberately sitting down to write the story of his life, fighting off death with all the might and strength of his giant will in order to save his name from dishonor and leave something for his wife and children after the death that he knew was not far away. Writing or dictating, sometimes 4, sometimes 6, sometimes 8 hours a day, so the months went on. It was a tremendous effort. In the 8 weeks that followed the 1st of May, he did more work in writing his book than in any other 8 weeks of his life. As an army in battle, sometimes gathers up all its strength for a final charge or for a last stand against the foe. So the old general, weakened by disease, worried by anxiety, but determined to win, actually held death at bay until the work he had set to himself was accomplished. At last the work was done. The book was finished. On the first day of July 1885, his preface was dated and signed. Just 3 weeks later, on the morning of the 23rd of July, 1885, the tired hand dropped limply within that of a patient, faithful wife. The last fight was over. The last victory had been won. The book he wrote and completed under these fearful conditions is one of the world's notable books, while its success more than met the desires of the writer and placed his family again in comfort and security. To the last, the great soldier's thoughts were all for peace. He had seen battles. He knew the horrors of war. He knew the beauty of peace. "Let us have peace," is what he used to say. Now think about how you learned history. Did you learn the facts and the information that wash away? The fact that the Civil War lasted from 1861 to 1865 has very little use for me. Or a list of all of the battles may be interesting, but I can't use it. But as the fox said to the little prince, only the heart sees rightly. What is essential is invisible to the eyes. As we use the tools of the heart and apply our hearts to understanding, here are just a few of the lessons that my heart received from these few stories and poems I just shared with you. Duty, integrity, honor, reputation, compassion, sacrifice, courage, forgiveness, love, the power of hymns and prayers to comfort the heart in dark nights, the power of music to stir the soul. As I read the story of the two generals, the thought crossed my mind, these men were both honorable men. Two honorable people can have different points of view. Isn't that a lesson we could use today? That two honorable people can have different points of view? That's a good heart lesson. Although the details may fade with time, the impressions will stay with me for a very long time, maybe even forever. When I see the name Robert E. Lee or Ulysses S. Grant, these impressions will instantly connect to their names in a flash. When I see the picture of the picket, all the feelings of the poem instantly will come back to me as a flash. Repetition is vital to learning, and that's why none of us can hold on to everything we come across, everything we read, everything we learn. So I have created a Story of the World notebook for myself. And I tell you to do this for yourself because if you assign this to your kids, it's going to backfire on you. But if they see you doing it and loving it, they're going to say, Mom, I want to do that too. So this is my Story of the Notebook, and you can see that it is loaded with, if I can get there, with pictures. Because a picture is worth 700,000 words. Every time I see a picture, it stirs up a memory of something, a story or an event that I have encountered. So the pages in this book are interesting people I meet along the way from history. And I place them in a chronological order by birth. And the kinds of things that I go on my pages are quotes that have struck my heart that I want to remember. It's all things I want to remember. If there's a story that I've heard, I put enough of the story down to jog my memory, and then I put where I can find the story, so if I want to go back and read the details, I can find it again. And so as I go through this, well, we remember 1620 was the Mayflower Pilgrims, or Mayflower Pilgrims. So I know that I'm going to be coming up on Charles I pretty soon. And there he is. Not yet, there he is. You remember the pictures that we saw. So when I see these things, I remember the lessons and the impressions that came to my heart. And I wrote the quote about what he said about the liberty, because I want to remember that again. And each time I place a page, I'm reviewing who came before them and who came after. So William Bradford was born 10 years before King Charles I. And I can see what the events and things that came after. And my heart is noting the flow of history. Who's living at the same time? Who what's going on in the world in one part of the country, when other things are happening in the other part. So let's come up on Robert E. Lee and see what's going on around him. There's Robert E. Lee. And he lived was born just before Cyrus McCormick. Queen Victoria, there's one I remember. Florence Nightingale. They were contemporaries. There's U.S. Grant. He's much younger than Robert E. Lee. And all of these things start to fit together. I even have back here, I love Corrie ten Boom, and I just put a page in for my grandmother because she's in history. So Corrie ten Boom was in Holland and my grandmother was in Sweden, and those all start to fit together. I have a friend that she said that her 14-year-old boy was holding his notebook like this one day. And he said, Mom, if people knew what was in here, they would know it's a treasure of great worth. And that's how I view this. This is a treasure of great worth because these are lessons to my heart. The facts are going to be in there, but the facts separate don't have any life. It's only when you wrap them in the story and the pictures and the poems that they have life and have long-lasting meaning, and that we can take lessons from them to use in our own life. Mind of its own. As this sweet mom said, I have spent the last 10 years of my life gathering resources to warm your children's hearts. And if you go to Libraries of Hope or welleducatedheart.com, it takes you to the same place. You will find thousands of stories, like I've read to you, poetry, images, pictures, fine art, that is yours to use. It's my gift to you. It's all free. And I hope you'll take advantage of it, because there was an era from about 1880 to 1920 when educators understood about educating hearts. So they used stories to teach history and science and music and art and all the subjects. And this wonderful body of literature, people that know children's literature, this is the golden age. And it's been buried in our age of intellectualism. But in the last 10 years, they've been digitized and they're online again. So what I've been doing is searching and digging and sorting and organizing them and linking them so that you have ready access and can use these stories to warm the hearts of your children. There's fine art on there, there's music, all the things that you need. And then one other thing I'll mention, I've created a Mother's University that at this same era, this was the time of Maria Montessori and Charlotte Mason and Rudolf Steiner, that they understood about educating hearts of children. And I've been compiling the writings and putting them in study guides and created this Mother's University, and that is really blurry, I'm so sorry. And my eyes are bad, but that's blurry. Anyway, it will be much clearer on the website. This is for you to come and relearn the lost arts of educating hearts of children. Moms, a lot of moms are starting study groups and kind of going through these study guides and learning these things. There's actually an introductory class on there that you can go through. There's so much in the site that it's overwhelming. Yes, it is overwhelming. So I try to, layer it in there, ease you through it, and hope that you'll be able over time to find the things that you're looking for. We truly are living in the day of the harvest. All the finest literature that has ever been written, all the great masterpieces of art and music have been gathered to this generation, that in the humblest home, on our little computers, our children can learn from the best of the best. And what's missing is warm hearts and a desire to learn. And that's where you come in. So my prayer is that you will be blessed as you relearn these lost arts of educating the hearts of your children, that they will take advantage of that and that they will rise up to be the generation that they're intended to be, the generation for which all time has been working to prepare the very things they need to learn from. And that's what you get to do. High adventure. Thank you so much for being here. And I'm not sure what time it is. If we have a couple minutes, I'm happy to take questions. Is it? Yeah, just about quarter to. Okay. 2 minutes. Any quick questions? Yes.
I'm just wondering, do you have it 8th grade reading list? You know what I mean?
The 8th grade, I have it sorted according to elementary, middle, and high school because there is such a variation. One 8th grader is not the same as another 8th grader. So I kind of have it broken down into a general developmental level. And I talk about that, you know, when you have children under 8, that's probably not the time to start history. So, you know, you're going to be going more with imaginative stories and such. But by middle, then you start the history stories and the stories of people and things like that.
Do you take any suggestions?
I certainly.
The single shot is fantastic.
A single, you know, I think I might, and that's actually on the, my brain. If you go on each of the online library pages, which you'll just have to go see, at the top of each page it says additional book recommendations. So I also have gone through and found books that you might be able to find in your library or be able to buy on Amazon, so you can have books in hand. So you've got the online library, and then you've got additional book recommendations too. And these are all books that came from this time when you warm hearts and teach some good values. The 60s is when we threw out all the rules of right and wrong. So, you know, it's affected our literature, and but there's lots of good stuff out there. So, any other questions? Well, you are dismissed. Class dismissed. Thank you again.